Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you all again, I hope. And for any new viewers who have not participated in one of these film talks before, this is a series we're doing as part of our ongoing programs at the Westdale, our theater in Hamilton, and to continue to engage and discuss film and share great films. This is the fourth of a series we were doing on, and the Oscar goes to best pictures that you may not have seen, not the classics, but ones that I think are particularly interesting and might be interesting to you guys, or might be worth a second look if you've seen it before. And then we do a little film talk, and then we have a Q&A session after we're done. So I would encourage you to get ready to ask some questions, and we're happy to respond and to, and again, they could be questions, comments, whatever you have to say based on your own experience of watching the film. Now, we're doing things a little differently, shaking it up. And tonight, I'm going to be sort of the person who does the housekeeping duties. And Jeffrey Bender, of course, who you all know, and you've been watching him doing and helping out with the slides and everything else, is going to do the film talk about a great movie. It was amazing to watch it again this week. I probably haven't seen it for 20 years. In the Heat of the Night, directed, of course, by perhaps Canada's greatest director, Norman Jewison, and of course, starring the incomparable Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger. And so any questions, any comments, please let us know. We're going to get started in just about a minute or so. The theater, as you know, is closed, but we've been doing private screenings at the theater. You can rent it for 9 of your best friends or relatives, or for a birthday or a special occasion. Whatever movie you want to see, we'll endeavor to get it for you, to show it. Free popcorn, free soft drinks, and it's gone very well. We've had a number of private screenings, and it's kind of a fun experience to have, kind of your own private screening room and see a great film, of course, up on the big screen. And then, of course, we're doing all of these online film talks and film clubs for free to keep everybody, engaged. But if you do feel so inclined, a donation is always appreciated. And of course, you can also go to the westdale.ca and see an archive of all the film talks we've been doing in the past. Besides this series, there was one called Film Noir that we did this winter. And when we wrap this up next Monday, we'll talk at the end tonight a little bit about the next series we plan to do. So it looks like the folks are pretty much here. So take it away, Jeffrey.
And I just want to attest, I was also at the Westdale for a private screening yesterday, and it was a lot of fun. So I certainly encourage that. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Bender, and I'm so thrilled to be able to take the helm. Thanks, Fred, for the opportunity. Let's get right into it. On April 10th, 1968, the 40th Academy Awards was held to honor the achievements of the films from 1967. Now, at the time of the broadcast, the nation was in mourning for the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which had occurred on April 4th in Memphis, Tennessee. 5 days later, King's funeral would take place in Atlanta, Georgia on the 9th, though the Academy Awards broadcast was originally scheduled on April 8th. There was pressure from members of the African American entertainment community, including Sammy Davis Jr., Diane Carroll, Louis Armstrong, and the star of tonight's film, Sidney Poitier, to cause the board of directors to preempt the ceremony. Now, the reason I mention this piece of trivia about the 40th Academy Awards is that I think it's important to provide some historical context to where In the Heat of the Night belongs in the midst of the turbulent times of the 1960s. By the time that legendary producer Walter Murisch was negotiating the film rights in 1965 for John Ball's mystery novel, which is the subject of tonight's talk, the following events had occurred and were occurring. In 63, in August, you will probably all be aware that the March on Washington, D.C., in which Martin Luther King gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech, occurred with 250,000 people in attendance from all across the country. In September 1963, a simple month afterwards, a bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, would kill 4 little girls. And I might encourage you, if after seeing this film, to seek out a very little known movie by Spike Lee, a documentary on that actual event. But that really got the attention of the entire nation more than anything, to see that this kind of terrorism was happening in the country. Beyond this, July 2nd comes around in 1964, which is really not that long ago, in which President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, preventing employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion. Malcolm X was assassinated the year after, in February, and Bloody Sunday, the march from Selma to Montgomery, occurs on March the 7th. And then, of course, August 6th, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act to ensure that there would be no discrimination against those that were voting. The reason I bring this up is that all of this was at a time in which this particular film should occur. And so the book was discovered by Poitier's agent, Martin Baum, who was his agent throughout his entire life. And he thought it would be an excellent vehicle for his client to stretch his acting legs. And he brought it to Walter Mirisch, who partners with his brothers Marvin and Harold. Incidentally, just a side note on those folks, I think it's important to know about them, is that they formed the Mirisch Corporation in 1957 to become one of the most successful producing partners in Hollywood history. They produced 68 films for United Artists, and some of their biggest hits were Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, The Magnificent Seven, The Great Escape, West Side Story, The Pink Panther, and so many others. So when Mirisch purchased the rights to In the Heat of the Night, he also signed Poitier to a 3-picture deal to produce a trilogy about the character we're talking about tonight, Virgil Tibbs. They're not great movies, but he signed on and he did They Called Me Mr. Tibbs and the Organization. Back to the other state previously, Mirisch could see from the news headlines that the time was right to tell a story that could challenge its audience, and he could see that Poitier was one of the only people working who could be convincing. Both a liberal and a pragmatic businessman, Mirisch convinced United Artists that it was an important story for the studio to tell. It had a bankable star attached, and even if it didn't run in the South, it would make money in the great northern cities. The budget was just over $2 million, and he was able to convince Poitier to take half of his usual fee at $200,000. But first, he would need a director. So here we enter Norman Jewison, and as Fred pointed out previously, perhaps one of the finest directors that ever came out of Canada. Born in July 1926, though, and he always likes to state this in many of his talks, if you've ever attended, which I had an opportunity to see him in the late 90s in Toronto speak, of which some of my notes are going to be integrated in this talk. He always liked to tell people that though his last name may suggest his religion, and that he directed The Fiddler on the Roof, Jewison was brought up Protestant, and despite being teased incessantly as a child at a time when anti-Semitism was common, he was often embraced by the Jewish community for being one of them. And so he liked to tell that often, because he also felt that he, as a person coming into the Hollywood community from Canada, that he was always an outsider in some form or fashion, and that he thought it helped him to be able to see stories from outsiders' points of view quite often. He was nominated for 3 directing awards for In the Heat of the Night, Fiddler on the Roof, and Moonstruck. He never won for director, but in 1999, he finally was provided an honorary award, the Irving G. Thalberg Memorial. A couple of other things to point out about him is that, and I think it's one of his proudest achievements, is that he founded the Canadian Film Centre in 1988 in an effort to develop filmmakers in directing, editing, producing, screenwriting, and acting. As a young man, if we go back into his history, Jewison enlisted in the Royal Navy, and he served between 1944 and 45. Upon returning from service, right around 1949, he had the bug to get onto the road and see the world. And one of the first things he decided to do was to set out and hitchhike south and see other places he had yet to experience. Wearing his Canadian service uniform, he got as far south to Memphis, Tennessee, where at this stage he boards a bus. It's a super hot day. He's in his uniform, and he opts to sit at the back where there's an open window so he could get some fresh air. At this point, he recalls being looked at, and the bus driver actually stopped the bus walked to the back and asked him if he was some kind of a joker. Frustrated and disgusted by his behavior, the bus driver pointed to a sign that Jewison recalls was written in this very crude tin with a black paint and hung up by wires that said "coloreds only" at the back of the bus. This caused him to be really aggravated after having, of course, experienced the war and having spent time with people that were of different nationalities and thinking that everybody should be treated equally. So he gets off the bus, and this was the time that he realized that things were really not fair and they were incredibly unjust in the United States, particularly. This experience, the reason I'm telling you this story, is that it actually encouraged Jewison and his want for storytelling about race equality. And what he would do in his career, there are 3 movies I absolutely recommend. Of course, tonight's movie, In the Heat of the Night. The other is A Soldier Story in 1984, and then The Hurricane about Reuben Carter, starring Denzel Washington in 1999. This is really his triptych on race and the inequalities of race. He started his career in TV, early variety shows on the CBC when it first went on the air in 1952, where he produced early Wayne and Schuster programs. Eventually, he would move to New York, and he worked in live television, directing The Andy Williams Show and specials with Harry Belafonte and Danny Kaye. He got a great reputation with producing and was very well known for directing the Judy Garland comeback special in 1961, starring Dean Martin and Sinatra. He'd go on to collaborate with Garland a lot on subsequent shows, but it was Tony Curtis who encouraged him to try features. And he would direct Curtis in his directorial debut, 40 Pounds of Trouble, which is not a very good movie. Of course, he did a lot of light fare, some Doris Day films, but he was getting quite bored with that. He wanted to tell stories about people, that real people. He dipped his toe in the water of challenging himself a little bit with a great movie called The Cincinnati Kid with Steve McQueen and Edward G. Robinson. But where he really started to get some of the notices was when he worked on a Mirish Corporation film called The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. Of course, you can look up his entire filmography online. He's got a very diverse filmography, and I mean, he's done so many different kinds of films that have touched my life, certainly. But due to Jewison's success as being nominated for Best Director for Russians and having the ability to make a political statement about the Cold War while still being entertaining, Mirish thought this is the guy that the political right had labeled a Canadian pinko and an outsider, who may be the best person suited for taking the lead of the film project In the Heat of the Night. So entering the project at this time, or previously rather, was film writer Sterling Silliphant. You may know him, or you may not know him, but you may have seen the name because it's a very peculiar name. He would have been behind creating Route 66 and the Naked City television series in the 1950s and 60s. Silliphant used to like to talk about how Jewison told him that his script was absolutely amazing and then would subsequently, over the course of 6 months, rewrite the entire film. The reason for this is that the book and the adaptation was rather heavy in its race message. And Jewison was a little bit concerned about being too far out into the open about creating a race message picture. And he wanted to focus more on the film as a murder mystery in which 2 unlikely people are thrown together to solve a case. Obviously, a Southern racist chief of police and a Northern black officer, and how they're forced to find some common ground between the 2 of them in order to do their jobs. Silliphant would make several changes to the script that would differ from the book that we'll talk about later. He also, of course, just a quick couple of credit points. He was also very well known for his work on Charlie, The Towering Inferno, and The Poseidon Adventure, in case you want to check out any more of those Silliphant movies. Let's talk about the production a little bit more. The other thing that Jewison insisted on was location. Rather than shooting on a backlot, which would develop a sense of, he wanted to develop a real true sense of authenticity. More and more people, of course, were watching the nightly news in 1966, and they were seeing the Vietnam War coming through their television screens, as well as some of the race riots that were starting to break out throughout the country. And so the sense of studio artifice for a serious film was being less tolerated. The main challenge here was that Poitier refused to film south of the Mason-Dixon line due to a run-in he and Harry Belafonte had with the Ku Klux Klan. Of course, his stories, some of the stories changed, whether it was Mississippi, Georgia, or South Carolina, but nevertheless, Poitier has been quoted as stating that the scene that we see in the film in which the rednecks are chasing him down the road is very similar to the experience that he and Belafonte had. Also, Poitier's daughter recently, prior to the shooting, had done a fundraising event to pay for the hospital bills of activist James Meredith, who'd been shot during his March on Fear. And as a result, she had a cross burned in her own front lawn. And so Poitier, as the most acknowledged Black actor in the world, was not keen on having a target on his back by going to the South for an 8-week shoot. So through location scouting, the production found its way to Southern Illinois, specifically Sparta, Illinois. And though the town in the script was Wells, Mississippi, they acknowledged that there's also a Sparta in Mississippi. Turns out there's a lot of Spartas everywhere in the United States. And to save money from having to paint the water tower and storefronts, they went with the name Sparta. Though there would be a need to dip into the South, that would involve Poitier, which I'll talk about a little bit later. On the subject of Sidney Poitier, which leads us to perhaps one of the most iconic actors of the 20th century, and a guy whose life is absolutely incredible. It's almost it's unlikely, as if it's from a storybook. Since we only have a little time to discuss this man, and there's a lot to tell about him, I'd still like to spend a little time to pay our respects by diving into his background and career a little. He was born in 1927. He just had his 94th birthday in Miami, Florida, 2 months premature to tomato farmers from a small island off Nassau in the Bahamas. And his father was prepared to give him up. He thought, no child can be born this early and survive. His mother went to a soothsayer or a tarot card reader who said, this man's going to walk among kings. And of course, eventually he would, if you consider Nelson Mandela a king, as so many do. He grew up in the islands until he was a teenager. And Poitier states that because of this experience of being around people of his own color that loved each other and were happy and lived a good life and didn't really have very much experience with direct racism, that it conditioned him to be incredibly confident about who he was as a person. And he really looked up to his father and felt that the man who is my father is the person that I am and I will become and I'll always honor. And so that really gave him an incredible sense of self. Ultimately, though, he would move to the United States and would find himself making his way to New York City by the time he was about 18 years old. It was while working as a dishwasher and living in bus stations that he took a chance by joining the American Negro Theater of Harlem in the 1940s. Here's where he would meet his lifelong friend, colleague, and fellow activist, Harry Belafonte. Due to Belafonte being unable to get out of a shift, his understudy Poitier took to the stage where a talent scout would see him and cast him in Lysistrata. He worked on stage for a number of years before he was spotted by a talent recruit for Daryl Zanuck of 20th Century Fox, and he was hired in his first role in the 1950 film noir No Way Out as a doctor who attempts to treat a patient who's a criminal and racist, played by Richard Widmark, and it was directed by Joseph Mankiewicz, so not bad for a first film. He and Richard Widmark would, of course, work together again in the Bedford incident and became actually quite good friends over their lifetime. Over the years, Poitier would continue to play bit parts of characters on the sidelines, with a notable role in Blackbird Jungle in 1955. But when 1957 rolled around, he was cast to star as a leading man in the movie The Defiant Ones alongside movie star Tony Curtis, and it was directed by Stanley Kramer, another person who became a close friend. This was unheard of at this point, to have an African-American face be at the same type of billing as a movie star, to have as much screen time as this particular individual. And of course, they had to have screen time together on equal parts because they're chained together for the majority of the film. It was this film that put Poitier on the map. And over the following years, he would appear in better leading roles, such as the film adaptation of the stage success, Raisin in the Sun in 61. And then in 63, Lilies in the Field would come along, in which he plays handyman Homer Smith, who aids an order of nuns to build their chapel, for which he would be the first Black person to win an Academy Award for Best Actor. A really huge, monumental event. If you consider less than, 13 years prior, he just started his film career. But for nearly 15 years, Poitier was really the only leading Black actor on the scene. He would tell his close friends, including Rod Steiger, that at times the responsibility of being the sole representative for all Black people was an overwhelming one to bear, that he was not allowed to lose his temper or act out for fear that he'd let members of his community down, or provide an excuse to those who would condemn his race that they were justified in their prejudices. In short, Poitier was really looking for roles that would give him more dynamic. In the year 66, Poitier would go to England to perform in To Sir with Love, while production got started on In the Heat of the Night. He came back promptly, started principal photography in September of 66, so you can tell he's just working back to back. A few months after shooting wrapped on Night, he would perform in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in early 67, which, of course, ended up being nominated alongside In the Heat of the Night for Best Picture. So as you can see, all of those movies were out in 1967. Poitier was everywhere, and people loved him. They felt that they could find a way in to that man, but as well as, to some extent, in a very safe way, to racial equality and some of the challenges that people were facing. Though people like James Baldwin might be critical that it wasn't a very realistic portrayal of a true Black person in America at its time. Over the course of his long career and life, Poitier would go on to direct films, including the very successful Stir Crazy with Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. He received a Knight of the British Empire in 1974 from the Queen of England. He was appointed ambassador of the Bahamas to Japan, and he's fluent in Russian. So, I mean, is a pretty extraordinary person, and we're going to talk more about him and his role in this film in just a moment. I'm going to move to his co-star in the film, Rod Steiger, who plays Bill Gillespie in this movie. On the other hand, Steiger was born in West Hampton, New York, had a really difficult upbringing. He was the son of an alcoholic mother, an absentee father who he never met. They were both actors in vaudeville, and he, of course, also experienced sexual abuse as a child. So he had a very, very hard time, and was essentially left to raising himself. In this sort of sense of looking for belonging, he enlisted in the Navy at the age of 16, and he served on a destroyer in 44 at the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he barely survived this incredible typhoon that occurred. His war experiences in childhood affected him as he struggled with depression and anxiety for his entire life. Eventually, as he came back on the GI Bill, he would join the actor studio, where he would meet Elia Kazan, and of course, as we know, they were partnered in perhaps one of the most iconic roles that Steiger played outside of this one tonight, which was the brother of Charlie in On the Waterfront to Marlon Brando's Terry. But one of the roles that I'd like to also talk about, that very, very briefly, and if you're able to find it online somewhere, it's a lovely performance of him in Marty, Paddy Chayefsky's television Playhouse version of Marty. He considered the opportunity to be able to possibly play it on the big screen, but the producers suggested that nobody would want to see somebody who'd already played it on television in the movies, hence Ernest Borgnine. But he's so good in it. Of course, a lot of movies that you would have recognized him in. There's a really great one that you don't hear or see enough, which was Bogart's last film called The Harder They Fall. So good in that. He played Al Capone. Of course, he was in Dr. Zhivago. But I think one movie to really note, if you've not seen it and you want to write it down and check it out at some point, would be Sidney Lumet's The Pawnbroker. And I would say in my scribblings in my notes that I thought it was worth mentioning, during an interview with Norman Jewison, the one that I talked about that I attended, he mentioned, "I absolutely loved Rod Steiger. You never knew what you were going to get, and that unpredictability is what keeps you feeling young." Steiger was a huge proponent of being curious, but he also suffered and struggled with mental illness for much of his life, and he became an early proponent and voice for mental health issues when it was still somewhat taboo to talk about. It should be noted that Steiger made $50,000 less than Poitier on this film as well, and so I think it was kind of interesting that we have people at that level that of course, Poitier was making much more, which was fantastic to see that there was some progression on Murish's part as a producer. A couple of other things to talk about before we get into the slides. Haskell Wexler. He is the director of photography, the cinematographer on this film. He's a peculiar individual. I don't know, Fred, if you ever worked with him or not, but he was born to a wealthy family. Another guy who signed up into the military in World War II with the Merchant Marines. His ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat, and he was adrift at sea for 10 days. Like, somebody should make a movie on Wexler's life, because he's done so many different things. He made industrial documentaries. He moved into television, Ozzie and Harriet. He did a lot of that. And he was a very political person. Wexler made documentaries in the cinema verite style, which you see some evidence of in this movie, and including a movie called The Bus, about a group of civil rights activists who take the long bus ride from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. in '63, as we mentioned earlier. Later, he'd fused this style of documentary with feature films, including his first feature film, Elia Kazan's America, America. And of course, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And if you've ever seen that movie, there's something about Wexler. I don't think he could sit down for very long, because he liked to have that camera in his hand, and he'd like to move around with it a lot. So if you see Virginia Woolf, you may need a Dramamine, because it is very much like that. But he won an Academy Award for that particular piece. He was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and he won 2 in his career. A couple of notable films I'll just throw out about Wexler if you're trying to remember. I wonder what his look was. After In the Heat of the Night was the Thomas Crown Affair, a highly stylized movie. He directed his own film called Medium Cool, a sort of counterculture film about the Chicago Democratic Convention. The Conversation, he worked on it for a period of time before he was fired, with artistic differences between he and Coppola. Also fired from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So tells you he was a very opinionated kind of person. But there are a couple films that I absolutely love, and I failed to mention that he knew Woody Guthrie when he signed up for the Merchant Marines, and they got to know each other a little bit. So it's only fitting that he was the cinematographer on Bound for Glory, the Hal Ashby movie. He also worked on Coming Home, another wonderful Ashby film that Fred recommended last week. There's a lot more to say about Wexler, and when I get into the slides, I can sort of cite that. But as we're talking about Hal Ashby briefly, I'll mention him as well. We don't often talk about editors during the film night, so I'll keep it very brief. But Hal Ashby is a peculiar individual. He was known primarily as a counterculture era director, but he got a start as a film editor, and he worked very closely with Norman Jewison, in which he cut the following films: The Cincinnati Kid, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, and of course In the Heat of the Night, of which he won best editing. And of course he did the Thomas Crown Affair, which he was also a producer on that film. You guys will know Ashby for directing things like Harold and Maude, Shampoo, The Last Detail. Of course, I mentioned Bound for Glory and Coming Home, and of course maybe his masterpiece, Being There, with Peter Sellers in the early 80s. Jewison mentioned in his talk that Ashby was like a brother to him, and that he was a hippie before it even had a word, that he would wear Jewison out in the editing room because he was so meticulous. And he actually edited this film down to 110 minutes, which is incredible. At times it has a few pacing challenges, but there are some really exceptional moments in this movie which we'll talk about. Due to Ashby's sensibilities as a storyteller, and likely due to a lot of marijuana, is what kept him going every night, because he certainly liked to do that too. So with that said, I'm going to switch over to our slides and take you on a little bit of a trip here of the images and some stories behind the scenes, and we'll talk about some of the other people that were involved as filmmakers on this particular production. And Fred, we should be able to see a train. Is that correct? Okay. So the film opens with a wonderful montage of images, starting with out of focus lights from an oncoming passenger train. And by the way, Wexler says that he shot this through a wire screen to create a pixelated image. So when you see those lights at the very front first, and they're all, they've got those sort of almost Liechtenstein Ben-Day dots, that's how he did that. But it's used to introduce us, this montage, to our protagonist as he steps off the train, luggage in hand, entering this train station depot in a strange little town in the middle of the night. Playing over the top of the images is the gospel blues wail of Ray Charles. And he's singing the lyrics of the writing duo Alan and Marilyn Bergman, and the music of Quincy Jones. And I want to talk about Quincy Jones for a moment. He is, of course, accredited for doing for Black musicians and composers what Poitier did for the African-American acting community in opening doors to get their foot in and be taken seriously for their talents. Over his 7-decade career, Jones was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, and he received the Jean Hersholt Award in 1994. He also won numerous Grammys, Emmys, and a Tony, and yet he didn't even get nominated for original score or song for In the Heat of the Night. And I can't get Ray Charles' song out of my head. I mean, it's sort of part of this film. The song would go to Leslie Becuse's "Talk to the Animals" for Dr. Dolittle. Jones's work on The Pawnbroker, directed by Sidney Lumet that I mentioned earlier, caught the attention of Jewison, and the moments of tension cut through with jazz that he uses in The Pawnbroker really struck the tone for what Jewison was looking for this particular movie. What I love about this score is the amount of times that you hear this, everything from rhythm and blues to gospel to rock and roll to the tension that rises. And you can see the influence that it would have on some of the police procedures that we are all accustomed to in the 1970s. Think about those Quinn Martin production films. He was, of course, known for casting his orchestras, and he has Toots Thielman on the harmonica, Billy Preston on the organ, Ray Brown on double bass, and of course the Rayettes for their background vocals, just to name a few people. And while on the subject of music, I thought I'll mention it now, Jewison wanted to avoid a pre-recorded music because of the cost, to keep the costs low. And so he added original songs interspersed with the score. So you see the point where we see Sam Wood, the deputy, doing his night patrol. We hear a song called "Bow-Legged Polly," which is performed by Glenn Campbell. And it's, a very silly kind of song, and it's intended to reflect the kind of nature of Sam's character. Whereas later in the film, we hear the creepy diner character listening to a song called "Foul Owl," which is clearly a play on Little Red Riding Hood by Sam Sham and the Pharaohs, but Jewison admits they just couldn't afford to get the music by Sam Sham. But I think it adds an interesting bit of authenticity to the type of music that they may have been listening to then. So after Tibbs enters the rail station, there's a cut to a close-up of a fly on a dingy centerfold calendar. It sets the tone for the grit and filth of the town of Sparta. Cinematographer Haskell Wexler states that this was his first color film, and he really didn't have a clue what he was doing. And I think he was being a bit self-effacing. And in fact, if you listen to the commentary of this particular film, he's constantly putting himself down and so unhappy about every shot that he's done in the film. But I think he did a pretty great job. During the filming, he would use a lot of macro lenses for extreme close-ups like the one you see here. He used smaller 35mm cameras that he could hold on to in order to sit right in the car, like in the patrol scene with Sam. Of course, we're going to talk about the zoom as well, and the extreme zoom shots. That is one in particular that occurs. All of this was explored, and then there's also a point where he's even playing around with Steadicams before they're even a thing. So this sets up the kind of place we're going to be in, and of course, Sparta, I don't know that it's a typical Southern town, but there are certainly a lot of eccentric characters in this particular town. And the first close-up we see is of Ralph Henshaw, which is portrayed by character actor Anthony James in his film premiere. Many of you will have probably recognized him from a lot of, playing a lot of weirdos in movies. And of course, maybe one of his most notable films later in his career was Unforgiven as the seedy bordello owner. But what's interesting about this movie is we see a close-up of this character who's got a rubber band and he's about to kill this fly, and it's already setting up the shot that this guy's actually the murderer. He's kind of giving away that this person is, interested in even, pulling the wings off of flies if he were able to. Here we see Warren Oates, who I find adds some real comic moments as Deputy Sam Wood. Jewison talks about how, while working on the script, that there was a need to interject humor, that life isn't just all seriousness all the time, but that even, the most reviling people or characters can be funny, and if we can sit back and enjoy those events. And so he wanted to ensure that there was enough humor throughout the film, and the back and forth that people like Sam has with Gillespie and some of the other guys in the police station. But he's a genuine good old boy. He was actually born in Kentucky, and the word is that Warren Oates, who became this sort of iconic actor in cult circles, is this kind of person in a way. Although he was very much behind the civil rights movement during its time. Of course, later, Jewison takes the audience on a police patrol with Sam as he listens to his transistor radio, and they drive around town, peering into a woman's house as she drinks Dr. Pepper in the nude. So this is a town where obviously nothing interesting happens, and so when Sam comes across Colbert's body, we begin to see that he's not really the only person on the force who's incompetent. He really just doesn't know how to deal with this. Later, of course, based on that scene with Dolores Purdy, we do learn that Sam has a little darker side as he has a dalliance with an underage woman. Again, this guy, I mean, Warren Oates is a person that people absolutely love. He was in a lot of the Sam Peckinpah movies, including The Wild Bunch and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. But many of you may remember him as Sergeant Hulka in Stripes with Bill Murray. Moving right along, here's the shot where we're introduced to the chief of police, Bill Gillespie, played by Steiger, as we mentioned. Jewison really wanted to get George C. Scott. He was focused on the possibilities of getting him. He was certainly the type of character that had this gruffness to him that could have played this role well. But it turns out that either it wasn't extended to Scott, or in some places of research would indicate that he wasn't available to do it. So of course they got Steiger, and Jewison was actually quite thrilled about this because he thought that Steiger looked like a redneck sheriff. Jewison had Bull Connor in mind when he thought of Gillespie, and if you Google Bull Connor, he wasn't a very nice man. He served as commissioner of public safety for the city of Birmingham, Alabama. And during the Freedom Rider period of the early 60s, he refused to put officers on duty to accompany the buses, which led them open to pretty brutal attacks by the KKK. So he often used this as a way to get into Steiger's head about the things he was hoping that he might take on as far as some of the characteristics. But according to accounts from Steiger, Jewison got him to chew gum. And Steiger didn't really want to, but reluctantly he took his word for it. He trusted him. They both trusted each other. But he soon recognized that as he was chewing gum in the scenes, that it was another way for him to communicate what his moods were. So when you watch his scenes, if he's chewing his gum quickly, it means that he's getting upset. Slower, he's calm. And if he has a realization about something, he sometimes comes to a full stop. And so it's a bit comical, but it's just this other side of this method actor, this guy that really would find anything that he could use to add more dimension. Incidentally, there is some trivia related to this, that he chewed 263 packs of chewing gum during the shoot. To help Steiger gain weight for the role, they also found a diner that served an excellent pecan pie. And being a method actor as he was, as I mentioned, he obliged. He also wore his boots all the time and never broke his accent at any time on set. He was afraid that he would slip into a New York accent and didn't want to mess that up. And of course, his Jewison script supervisor, Mina Rebner, who had, just a side note, had been William Faulkner's mistress, was also his voice coach. And who should know better than Mina Rebner how to have that Mississippi accent? She told him that, Mr. Steiger, we in the South pronounce our T's. So sort of challenged him quite often. This next shot is, of course, that last shot was at the scene of where they found Colbert's body. And of course, we see all of this running around in which people are sort of discombobulated, don't know really what to do. And of course, they decide, let's look for a stranger. It must be a hitchhiker. So they send Sam off to the depot to see who's there. And sure enough, who's there but Mr. Virgil Tibbs. This is one of Jewison's favorite shots in the entire film. And Sam enters the station and yells, "Get up, boy," a phrase and expression that was on the same plane of humiliation as the N-word during that period. What Jewison was hoping to do was he wanted to express the image of humiliation in Poitier's face. What's he feeling at this moment? He wanted to pull the audience in very early on to empathize with this character and feel his vulnerability. In John Ball's book, the character Virgil Tibbs was a much more passive character, and the racism was much more overt. Jewison, in working with screenwriter Sylvan, really decided to move this so that this portrayal of him, so that he would stand up for himself a little bit more and say what was on his mind. In these series of scenes also, we get a sense of the tension between Tibbs and Gillespie. They're both big personalities who threaten one another. Gives Gillespie's position and intellect Tibbs' very life and safety. And here's a point as well where Wexler talks about how he lit the scenes differently, in which he would put silkscreen on the ceilings in the darker locations to ensure that they were able to see and pull out the facial expressions of Sidney Poitier better. And it was really one of the very first films where they changed and experimented with lighting to ensure that that his face is very well seen. In previous scenes, if it was lit too dark, then he would become a little bit more blurred. If it was too bright, then there was a bit more of a glare because of his complexion. So Wexler kind of experimented and found a way in to be able to do this. Of course, there's this great line in which Gillespie says, how much they pay to do their police work. He says $162.39 per week. $162.39 a week? Well, boy, Sam, you take him outside, but treat him nice, because a man that makes $162.39 a week, we do not want to ruffle him. Now, obviously, this is Gillespie's vulnerability coming out, feeling like there's too many cooks in the kitchen, as it were. And of course, he, in a strange twist of fate, as they're trying to assess whether or not Tibbs is a real guy, the police captain over Tibbs encourages him to work along with the gang. I did research on that, folks. I couldn't find out whether that was credible. So if you know whether it is, please put it in the Q&A. But according to Jewison, Poitier was a bit intimidated of Rod Steiger in real life. There was a bit of tension on the set, particularly because Steiger could be really intense and was applying his Stanislavski methods of acting, which at times veered over the top. Also, Jewison at this stage in this film went out to San Francisco just to see how it would play. And he talks about seeing an early screening of the film in San Francisco in which the audience were laughing aloud. Jewison was really nervous, appalled, and thought that they had a disaster on their hands, only to have his worries quelled by his close friend and editor on the film, Hal Ashby, who helped put things in perspective, that they were laughing at the bungling of Sam's character and the humiliation of Gillespie, that they have wrongly arrested a black police officer. And so I think, again, it goes back to Jewison talking about often the senses of the timing, the humor that he's incorporated in this film, and being okay at times to laugh at certain situations. Here's another, I'm going to go through a couple of these slides just to give an indication of what they were, working toward as far as this idea of Tibbs demonstrating his sense of professionalism and respect. This is a big scene as well where he's handling a white man's hands. Keep in mind the context I referred to earlier. This is 1966, 67. And audiences, they were a little concerned about this particular scene as to how audiences would react. And of course, what it's also showing again is that this guy is way over top of the Gillespie character. But what he does is he is already realizing, how do I support my situation here? He's in a very precarious position. And what he does is he asks, as he's going through all the statistics and all of the things that he believes is going on with the corpse, he throws it over to the chief to, as giving him the option to agree with his assessment of what's going on. So it's an interesting idea. But the other thing that you see, it's a little subtle, but there is a point that Tibbs asks, "Where can I wash up?" This is after Gillespie is left, and the undertaker, the funeral parlor attendant, basically just gestures with his face at the sink. Of course, at this time, even during this period in '66, having whites only and colored only sinks was still, unfortunately, very much how things were. Moving right along, of course, they get the idea, and I'm only sharing this. I'm not going to get through every plot point to this evening. I know you've all seen the movie, but this is one of those moments where they did a long shot and zoomed right in onto the bridge, and Jewison was so enamored by this shot that he would end up adopting zoom quite frequently in the future. And all you need to do is see the Thomas Crown Affair to realize how much he uses zoom. I mean, a lot. Also, of course, I mentioned Wexler worked briefly on The Conversation. The very opening shots of The Conversation, there are wide shots in zoom. And that particular motif or style really started to it came into vogue a lot in the 1970s. You see it all the time. There was another scene, and I couldn't find a good image for it, but you remember when the bloodhounds are after Harvey, played by Scott Wilson. Wexler, what he did is he rigged the camera to a couple of 2x4s and a bicycle tire to get the dog's eye view as he, cycled through the foliage and the leaves so that they get just a slightly different kind of shot. As you can tell, Wexler was really experimenting a lot. So in this scene, Virgil delivers the news to Mrs. Colbert that her husband is dead and has been murdered. And wanted to talk a little bit about the actress Lee Grant. She was born in the mid to late 20s. She started her showbiz career very young at the age of 4. But she really, her star was rising very quickly as a young woman. She attended the Actors Studio, and she earned a role in William Wyler's film Detective Story in 1951 with Kirk Douglas. And this is like her first film, and she was nominated for a Best Supporting Actress award. The problem that occurred in her life was that in 1952, she was blacklisted by Hollywood for 12 years, due in part to her affiliation with her husband, who was a screenwriter, Arnold Manoff, but was also caught giving a very passionate eulogy at a colleague and friend who was also associated with the Communist Party and was an actor. And I apologize, his name is escaping my mind currently, but he was a character actor throughout the 20s and 30s and 40s. But her name got tagged, and one of several people, director Edward Dmytryk would name in the McCarthy area. So she took stage roles during this time and teaching jobs to survive until she was cast in the TV series Peyton Place in the mid-60s. And then her career started to take off again. But one thing, and it's kind of, I've heard lots of interviews with Lee Grant over the years, she kept her age very close to her chest. She even went so far as to talk to the mayor of Los Angeles to see if they could doctor some of her documents so that she could play younger. Because she was very, very concerned that she was going to get slighted, as so many actresses would do in their 30s. So she was in Valley of the Dolls and The Heat of the Night, of course, naturally, in this very short role, which we'll talk about in a second. The Landlord with Hal Ashby. And of course, she starred in Shampoo, directed by Ashby, in which she won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar. And she's had a long career. She's still out there. And of course, she would herself go on to direct dozens of documentary features, including an Academy Award-winning film, Down and Out in America from 1986, which is about Reaganomics. She only has 4 short scenes in the entire film. Grant's performance in this scene, it's so instinctive. It has this visceral quality of someone who is truly in a state of shock. And despite her ideals or beliefs, of which really aren't fully on the surface, she accepts this short consolation from Virgil, in which she grasps his hand and doesn't let go. And this is the second shot within the course of under 5 minutes in which we see his black hand holding her white hand. And I know many of you are thinking, well, what's the big deal about that? But be reminded that the year after this film was released, that Petula Clark and Harry Belafonte were in big trouble because Clark touched Belafonte's arm during a duet on national television. So there was, a lot of stigma attached about this commingling, this connection. It is so ridiculous. But she's really amazing in it. Of course, this shot, really briefly, is the first example of many mistakes that Gillespie will make and be humiliated because of his incompetence throughout the film. And this is where we really start to see that how the two men, Gillespie and Tibbs, how they operate. Gillespie is just visceral anger, forceful, assertive, and Tibbs he's calculated. He's a thinker. He's a person who has a lot of patience and poise and centeredness. And so, of course, in this particular scene, they bring in the Harvey character, and this is that part where we recognize that as they go back and forth, and Gillespie's not interested in giving up his point of view that Harvey is their man, the first of many mistakes he would end up making in the investigation, that he ends up getting very much in Virgil's face, to the point that he says, "Virgil, that's a funny name for an N boy," I'm going to say the N-word boy, "to come from Philadelphia. What do they call you up there?" And this is that very famous line, "They call me Mr. Tibbs." And this is all of that frustration coming out onto the screen. And I've read some social commentary on this, and that really this is the part where Poitier is saying this for every person that's in the theater that's been held down. So with this back and forth and an obvious mismanagement of the case, Mrs. Colbert interrupts with, "My God, what kind of people are you? What kind of place is this?" It's the same kind of line that you might expect to hear in a horror film like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, something of that nature. And, I'm looking at this particular image, and Poitier's, his presence in this movie is just incredible. Again, here's another shot of Poitier. Let's bask in his greatness, and this really wonderful shot where he's having this discussion with Harvey. I thought I'd show an example of a depth of field shot here at the train station where Gillespie has to come back and convince him to work on the case. Otherwise, Mrs. Colbert is going to pull the entire operation out of Sparta. I thought this was an interesting scene, very, very brief, but there are several scenes through the film in which you see Virgil quietly observing others around him to see the differences between where he's coming from and what's going on with locals. Let's not forget, he states that he makes $162 a week as a police officer, but if that's in today's money, he's he's not wealthy, but he's making certainly probably far more than Gillespie was making, or anybody in Mississippi at that time. And this is this point where this family, they realize we can protect this man, and we realize what he's got himself into by being here. Tibbs says they've got a murderer they don't know what to do with, and they need a whipping boy. Now, I'll spend a little bit of time on probably the most famous part of the film. Despite the earlier agreement between the production and Poitier about filming south of the Mason-Dixon line, Jewison was able to convince Sidney that there was a need to film a scene in which Tibbs and Gillespie drive through a cotton plantation. This is really meant to reinforce that Gillespie's still prejudiced. There's a scene in the car where they're driving along, and there's clips and close-ups of people picking cotton, and he says, "None of that for you, eh, Virgil?" He makes these sly little comments, which he wouldn't say to anybody else, except for the fact that Virgil is the new order. He is what changes on the horizon, and it really threatens Gillespie. And his racism just constantly comes out. It's so interesting with I find with his performance is that there are times where he's so tender, and you feel this connection or this ability to at least sympathize with the character of Gillespie, because you see he's in pain as a person. But then he does these things where you're just reminded of, this is who this guy is. Jewison explains that the shots in the car, of course, were all handheld. This is that documentary element that he was trying to incorporate. But this is filmed all in Dyersburg, Tennessee. It's about 2.5 hours south of Sparta, Illinois. And during the talk I referred to earlier, Jewison mentioned that they found, of course, they were there for 2 to 3 days on the film. They actually cut it short because of threatening calls and conversations that were happening in town pointed at Poitier. So as I mentioned earlier, they were able to only find like a Holiday Inn that had those separate cabins and bungalows. And it was one of the few places that would allow whites and blacks to cohabit. So rather than welcome a Hollywood film crew to town, the locals were very unhappy. And one evening, Poitier and Jewison and Steiger and others could hear a truck driving around in circles in the parking lot, revving the engine high. So Jewison calls Poitier's room to let him know that they had it under control. When Poitier said, "I've got it under control too, as I'm carrying a piece under my pillow." It turns out there was a young guy whose wife had run off, and he assumed that she was with the film crew. But they were able to convince him otherwise, and away he went. But things started to escalate until finally they said, "We got to cut this short." Let's move into the Endicott conversation. You see here that there's this use of orchids in this place. They kind of enter, by the way, there's another shot where they walk into this place, and there's what they used to call a lawn jockey. It's a very racist statue on the front of the lawn that you see Gillespie rubs the head of. Those kinds of things. And even I, as a child growing up in Ontario, would see these in rural neighborhoods. But he comes into this environment, and at first there's this avuncular, rather genteel quality to Endicott as this indicator of the Southern aristocracy. The orchids were, Jewison says, interesting cinematically to use. I thought it was incongruous that you come into a scene to question somebody and they're surrounded by flowers. But ironically, Endicott, who's played by Larry Gates here, uses the orchid as a metaphor for how the Negro needs caring for, and that too much change too quickly can be fatal. Of course, this is the moment in the film in which we encounter the famous slap scene. The first time in a movie in which a black person had physically assaulted a white person, at least in America. If you recall, as the slap occurs, Endicott strikes Virgil for implying that he's involved in the murder. And in an early script, Sylphant has Virgil telling the butler to pray to God before striking him back. Poitier stated that there's no way that he would say that and would not just take it either, hence the shocking reaction. Jewison says that they practiced this shot. He was coaching Larry Gates to try to not hit too close to the ear, hit him on the fatty part of the cheek underneath the ear, then you can take a pretty hard slap. So then he practiced with Larry Gates, having him slap him so that he knew that he could really nail him. And a very disturbing moment for this elderly gentleman. He said they did it in 2 takes, and he used the first one because there's something about being caught off guard that was essential to the moment. Nobody really expected him to slap Sidney. And of course, there had been this philosophy in the civil rights movement for a long time about nonviolence in that philosophy. And this particular moment tells the audience that we're not taking this anymore. Things are going to change. And of course, the very famous reaction of Rod Steiger, which of course, when Endicott says, "What are you going to do about it?" Gillespie doesn't even pull his gun. He's so in shock. He says, "I don't know." Such a great reaction. But Rod Steiger really didn't know how to play the scene. But Jewison coached him and said, "I want this to be completely honest. You're a white cop. He expects you to respond, but it comes as a shock to you. Don't complicate it." And so that's the reaction that we get. And of course, I had to add this particular image of Endicott, who clearly realizes that things are changing. He says to Tibbs, there was at one time where I could have had you shot. I have 2 anecdotes about the slap scene. During a screening of the film, Jewison said in the talk I attended many years ago that he was seated next to Ray Charles in the cinema. When Endicott slaps Tibbs, there was no reaction. But when Charles heard the second slap, he grabbed Jewison by the arm and said, "Was that second slap what I think it was?" To which Jewison responded, "Uh-huh." And Charles smiled in glee to say, "Oh man, here we go." The other is that on a couple of occasions, Poitier and Steiger, and I really think this is a very adorable story, went into a theater in uptown Manhattan to guess how many white people were in the theater by the amount of shocking hushes would occur when the slap happened. And they would try to determine how many black people were in the theater based on the amount of cheers. So this is all coming from Steiger and Poitier, I think in Poitier's autobiography. Moving on, this very quick point in which Virgil loses his composure. He talks about pulling that fat cat down. He says he's close. He needs more time. They're trying to run him out of town. And then, of course, Gillespie says, "Man, you're just like the rest of us, ain't you?" And we get this close-up of Virgil, who has this realization that he's been pulled into letting hatred cloud his judgment, which he'll admit later in showing that he's aware himself. I'll go through this very quickly. These were the scenes of these good old boys, these redneck racists, that very rare action scene in the movie, but it's used to indicate the violence that was very real. Interesting over the head shot. And then a down curved shot here. Almost a Dutch angle, if you will. Just keep on moving here. And we see, again, this is before they go on this ride along with Sam, another example of Wexler's cinematography and composition. And he talks about how they had to get the highest wattage of neon lights they could to reflect off the police car. I thought this was an interesting shot of Gillespie as well, as they realize, Sam's not going to take his normal route. And I interpreted this image as interesting in that this character is frequently humiliated throughout this film, and he's really not in control of this investigation. And each time he tries to take control and makes decisions, they prove to be an error. And he just looks so tired and old and sort of lost in this particular image with that cage as he's in the back seat and Virgil's in the front. I don't have much to say about Quentin Dean as Dolores Purdy, a little bit of an over the top performance. She didn't really have much of a career. She stopped acting in '69. But this was another way for Jewison to illustrate the racism without being overt about it, as Purdy's brother angrily reacts to Gillespie that he had no right to allow an N-word to be present, and it suggests why he rounds up a lynch mob for the end scene. So it's just really playing into the plot of the mystery. And again, more of the mystery plot starting to unravel, and we're starting to see that Sam is not actually the murderer, even though he may have already been with an underage woman, which is its own problem. But we realize that Sam couldn't have drove two cars, is what comes out here. But it's that very famous scene of Gillespie still being so short-sighted. I got the motive, which is money, and the body, which is dead. And this is how police work works in the South at this time. Now, I think the other, in my opinion, one of the best scenes in the entire movie is this scene at Gillespie's home, in which he tells him that he's one of the chosen few. He tells Tibbs, "You're one of the chosen few, one of the first human beings to be in his space." He says, "I got no wife, I got no kids, I got a town that don't want me, an air conditioner that I have to oil myself, and a desk with a busted leg, and this place." And he says, "I'll tell you a secret. Nobody comes here. Never." And this scene was shot on location, and during the shoot, the rain was coming down so hard on a tin roof that they couldn't hear. So while they waited for the rain to subside, they opted to sit in a car and they improvised the scene. Steiger called Poitier Black Boy. Jewison questioned it, but Poitier said it was a believable thing to happen. During Steiger's acceptance speech, he thanks four people, and one of those, of course, is Sidney Poitier for being his friend and helping him see things from Poitier's point of view, so that he would know how can I maneuver in this particular role. And they remained friends. They got on very, very well. Steiger also interpreted Gillespie that he was a lonely gunfighter, pulled on his own experience of loneliness growing up in his own life, and that he says, "I was on my own since I was 10 years old." His motivation, Gillespie's, was to be left alone. The murder pulls him out of his comfort zone, and now he's facing his incompetence and his inabilities. And of course, this is where all this rage comes from. And of course, there's a point at the end where, in this particular scene that's interrupted, in which he feels that he's being pitied by, an African-American man, and that doesn't bode well for him. Hence the rage. That's all he knows is rage. Really briefly, Bea Richards, she plays this character who was an abortionist, and it's an interesting little scene between the two of them. But I included this. First of all, she was quite an incredible character actress who I think deserves her due. But she was also the mother in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and she was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. She was only really a few years older, maybe 6 or 7 years older than Poitier, but she plays his mother in that particular film. And then as we're getting to the end here, there's another action shot used because Jewison was afraid that the audience, when they found out that Ralph, the guy from the diner, was the murderer, that people would not buy it, that they might walk out. And so, perhaps tongue in cheek, he talks about how part of making movies is to distract with action. And so if something like that's happening, bring in this mob of people. They employed all of this really cool lighting from Wexler, and then create this chaos. But it also gives a little more insight into the story of the place where Tibbs is, that he's outnumbered. He's not safe despite all of his abilities and his intelligence, that none of that could save him in the end if there weren't, some of the other actions that happen. Of course, it is based on his intelligence of getting them to engage with Ralph. And then, from there, I mean, they have a cutaway shot. Ralph is... it's an exposition scene. I don't think that it was even necessary, but he's confessing that he didn't mean to kill him. And once that's tied up, we're at the train station. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a really good shot of the two of them walking with, but this is a really tender moment where Gillespie's carrying his suitcase in a way of showing that, there's a slight element of respect here. And they have very little dialogue between the two of them. Everything that's been said has already needed to be said up to this point. He says, "Thank you." And as Virgil climbs up the stairs, Gillespie yells out, "Virgil, you take care now," you hear, smiles and walks away. And one wonders, well, I think the movie got a lot of, from its critics, got a lot of finger wagging, saying, well, that's, that's not real life. This isn't going to tie up all of the world's ills when it comes to inequality. But nobody's saying that Gillespie's fixed and that he's, going to be on the straight and narrow and be a good guy. He's a complicated man. And of course, what I think is that this is Tibbs' story and his ability to see that things were, things are a lot better in the North, but that this inequality and this racism that threatened his life at times in this movie is incredibly problematic. And of course, the music begins and a helicopter shot pulls away to show the train leaving Sparta. Last note before we get into the questions and answers was that I just wanted to point out at the 40th Academy Awards, and by the way, on the left you see Ashby, there's Jewison, there's Steiger, and that's Walter Mirisch on the right. These are the movies that this movie was up against. It was The Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Bonnie and Clyde, and for whatever reason, Dr. Dolittle. But I think what's interesting is that it shows how things were changing in the film industry and the kinds of movies that were being made. And that's maybe time for a different conversation down the road, but it's really fascinating to me to see the kinds of movies that were happening. In fact, we won 5 of the 7 awards: Best Sound Mixing, Best Editing with Hal Ashby, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Actor, and of course, Best Picture. Jewison states, and this was in a Hollywood Reporter interview, it's amazing how people always tell me, that film plays today just as well as it did then. But I say that's sad. To still have that kind of racial confrontation in America is very sad. And so on this note, again, thank you for listening to the talk, and let's have a look and see some of the questions. But first of all, to allow me to have a glass of water, Fred, do you have anything to add or any questions?
Yeah, I just want to add, first of all, thank you. I think that was a wonderful talk, very exhaustive, wonderful detail. For me, watching the film this week, as much as I, remembered the film, loved the film, there were aspects of it that I found a little disappointing. I thought the story was sort of flabby, the whodunit, narrative. I might have liked the hour, 10-minute version of this movie, to be honest with you. But, as I've always learned, what really matters most about a film are those 3, 4, 5 moments, those indelible moments that stay with you and that you'll remember, a week from now, a month from now. And there's no question that there are those moments in this film. Obviously, in the ones Jeffrey mentioned, They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, the slap, for me, the scene with Lee Grant, and then, of course, the scene at Gillespie's house, and those 4 scenes, and we've talked about this with Best Years of Our Lives, but it's really the ability for those moments to occur in a movie that I find really elevate a film to being something special. So certainly it was a film for its time. The impact it had was tremendous. In fact, what some of you probably or may not know is that it actually became a television series. That in 1988, they had a TV series called In the Heat of the Night. It ran for 7 years on network television with Carol O'Connor playing Gillespie and Harold Rollins playing Mr. Tibbs. And many, many more people saw this television series than ever saw this movie, right? The viewership. And this was, to Jeffrey's point, this wasn't just 1967. This type of racism, these stories, which in a way is what the television series was as well, continues on today. And I think it's kind of remarkable. The 2 films that were sequels were not successful, even though Sidney Poitier was in them. He had to do them because he was under contract. I don't think he necessarily wanted to be, and none of them involved Norman Jewison or Sterling Silverfond. They were done by different directors and writers, I think, But this TV series, I don't know if you can find it, but I remember the TV series, and I remember thinking how interesting this was and how shocked I was that this actually appealed to enough Americans Canadians, I don't know, but that this continued on for 7 years. So there was something here that really, really struck a chord with America at a very particular time. And I think, and that's really, of course, why we chose the film and thought it would be interesting to watch today. But in terms of, kind of great filmmaking, again, personally, I find those zooms and all the trick camera work kind of very dated. People don't really do that so much anymore. So, it was just interesting to watch again. So, but anyhow, I thought the talk was great. Let's hear what the audience has to say.
Sure thing. Why does, and Fred, feel free to chime in here as well, because I don't know if I know the answer to this one. Why does Virgil not tell them he is a police officer right away? Thanks, Ron Ballard.
Well, I think because he would have gotten shot. I mean, if he had reached into his coat to try to pull out the badge, he would have been shot. They would have thought he was going for a gun or something. So, and for him to say, I'm a police officer, would have just been unbelievable. And also, it makes for better movie, better storytelling.
That was the answer in mind.
That's a reality, but I think basically it's he couldn't really reach for his badge.
And of course, Ron's got another question that I think I know the answer to this, but why does Virgil go off into the night after Sam reveals the change in his route, especially since this is right after he was almost killed by the group of thugs who chased him to the warehouse? I mean, I know he's going to go and check out where would Sam have normally been going, because he does refer later to the fact that he won't admit it, but he knows that Dolores Purdy is someone who likes to pose in the nude in her window. So how does he know that?
But how does Virgil know that?
Because I think Virgil went and found her and saw it. Is what my guess is. But he's playing coy.
Ron. That's the kind of weak storytelling I feel sometimes happens, where something happened off screen, we don't really know what it is, we can't kind of explain it, so we got to kind of fill in the blanks.
Yeah, no, for sure. Let's see. Barbara Maisonneuve, the Dr. Pepper, was the concept of product placement as big a deal now?
I don't think that was product placement. I think that was Dr. Pepper was so iconically known as a Southern product, So it was just a way of really placing us in a very specific time. Because I can remember, hearing about Dr. Pepper growing up in New York, but you couldn't get it, in the 60s. It was only, kind of later that actually penetrated other markets. So it was a Southern drink.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time in the South working over the years, and it is definitely still the drink of choice down there. Lots of kidney stones too, I might add, down there. But anyway, we've got more comments than questions. But there is, have you read Pictures at a Revolution by Mark Harris about the 5 Oscar candidates from that year by Jeff Duncanson? I have read it. It's an excellent book, and I highly recommend it. It basically does a little anatomy class on those 5 films that I mentioned before, and how each one of them were made, and their influence, and the stars at the time. And yeah, it's a very, very fascinating book and an interesting premise. I highly recommend it. It's called Pictures at a Revolution.
Yeah. And how extraordinary for Poitier that year to be in this film, to Sir with Love, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I mean, that's quite a year for any actor. But it's also interesting to note that in all 3 of these parts, he plays an educated, well-dressed, professional man, black man, but that is still the kind of black man that was acceptable and was appropriate at the time. He's not, so there was some limit to the range of roles that he was really wanting to do and were acceptable to the audience. And again, we're challenging the audience because people weren't used to seeing a black man wearing a fancy suit. That was a very striking image for a young black teenager, to look at and see in a movie. And the power of just that visual image is, can't be underestimated. But it is interesting that all 3 of those movies, he played a similar kind of character in a way.
Well, and I want to say it was James Baldwin. There's a lot of research, so I may be misquoting here a bit, but I read the comment of why couldn't, unfortunately, Poitier couldn't grab a woman passionately in his arms, whether she was white or black, and really have this, intense love scene. And, it was just not going to play at that time. And that tells you that, there was obviously, if you just go about 4 years into the future, things changed a lot as far as films were concerned, and the types of actors that were in films, but the kinds of stories that they told, where you're looking at real life Black people. There's a movie I'd recommend called Claudine with James Earl Jones that I highly recommend if you're looking for a film that's just not far after this, but tells you a beautiful story about people living just living their lives. Let's see, we've got a couple of other points as well. And by the way, Fred, that's a great point. I know that it weighed on Poitier quite a lot as well as an actor, of having that sort of burden, but not also being able to pull himself away from what you were talking about as well. Laura McVeigh asks, was the human race line from the end of the book ever in the screenplay? It seemed to end the story on a note of poking fun at Gillespie as opposed to the sense of camaraderie in the film. I have to admit, Laura, I did not have an opportunity to read the screenplay. I read much of the book, but I'm afraid I didn't get to see the end of that particular piece. So,
but it's a great question, and again, personally, I found that final scene kind of disappointing. It just kind of petered out, and again, to me, that's really kind of screenplay, issues more than performance or acting or directing issues. But just another example, I think, where the screenplay really doesn't hold up as well as some other aspects of the film.
Our friend Margarita says, I found the movie heart-wrenching, as did I. It shows the blatant racism that sadly still exists. On a side note, I had the pleasure to meet Mr. Sidney Poitier at the Fulfillment Fund Gala in LA a couple of years ago. He's so kind and gentle. Did you ever get a chance to meet him, Fred?
I did meet him once, but just very briefly at one of the AFI salutes. When I was a young guy working in Hollywood, I worked on the AFI salute to Henry Fonda, which was the third AFI salute that when they first started doing this back in the late 70s. And Poitier would come, and he was part of that kind of crowd who came to show their respects to Henry Fonda at the time, who actually wasn't a very nice guy at all, and it may have even been a bit of a racist, but that's a whole nother story.
Just a couple more. I know we've kept everybody late. I probably talked too long. When you said I was exhaustive, maybe it was exhausting as well. But I was going to say that with your knowledge, by the way, Fred, with how things occur with the Academy, do you feel that because of the fact that Poitier was in so many movies, that this is why he was looked over for a nomination that year?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly, to be honest with you. It wasn't a studio film, so it didn't get it was distributed by United Artists or through MGM, but it wasn't a studio film. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the voting for the Academy Awards are done by people who are in the Academy and who also work for studios. So they often, will vote for that film, and perhaps that's how Dr. Dolittle got in there. I can't remember the studio that did it, but so this was a bit of a strange, iconic, weird, different kind of film. And in fact, if it's not inappropriate, that's a good segue to our next film, which we're going to be talking about on Monday night, which of course is Midnight Cowboy. And Midnight Cowboy is actually one of my absolutely favorite films of all time. And if you haven't seen it, it's a difficult movie. I sort of warn you a little in advance. It was X-rated at the time, though later became R-rated. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily that it's so incredibly violent or so much sexuality or something in it, but it's a tough film because it really exposes you to a culture, of New York City and the kind of dregs of New York City, and really bears, the souls of some very kind of, challenged characters. But it's one of the great love stories of all time, at least in my opinion, and one of the first kind of, bromances, if you want to call it that. And there's quite a bit of humor in it as well, and fantastic performances. But the fact, again, that film was to win the Academy Award and many awards in 1969, and not just be a critical success, but it was a huge box office success as well. really speaks to how, what was going on in America in the late 60s, the cultural shift that was going on, and the shift that was going on in Hollywood. And, we've talked about this period in then the early 70s with, Chinatown and, and all the great movies that were starting to come out, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And really, this was sort of the beginning of a lot of that. 67 is what obviously Bonnie and Clyde was, a very seminal movie in its own way at that time. So anyhow, it was great to see everybody. Thanks so much for joining us again. Thank you again, Jeffrey, for this great talk. And there were a lot of detail I didn't know about the film, so wonderful to hear all that. Please join us again next Monday. And at that time, we'll talk a little bit about another series that, we're going to kind of maybe take a break for a week or two. But, this has been a great experience for me, and I hope for all of you. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. So stay safe, enjoy the great weather, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Fred. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.